The Werribee Line is a 31-kilometre electrified broad-gauge suburban railway line running from central Melbourne through the old inner suburbs of Footscray and Newport, then out across open country to Laverton, Hoppers Crossing and Werribee, passing through grasslands, housing estates and lots of heavy industry. Uniquely among Melbourne suburban lines, the Werribee Line splits in two for part of its length, with a fast express route between Newport and Laverton, and a scenic single-track branch running through the seaside suburb of Altona. There's also a short branch in the form of the Williamstown Line, and I'm going to cover that in this video too. Before we get stuck into it, a little bit of context about the nature of this line. The Werribee Line was originally part of the Country Main Line between Melbourne and Victoria's second largest city, Geelong, and up until 2015, V-Line Country trains shared the line with suburban trains between the city and Werribee. However, in that year, the regional rail link opened, diverting V-Line trains via a longer but faster route up around through Sunshine, Deer Park and Wyndham Vale, connecting with the original route out beyond Werribee. While it's not shown on the network map, the connection between Werribee and Little River is still there and is used by a small number of daily freight trains. V-Line trains no longer run via Werribee in normal circumstances, but it does happen occasionally for transfers, training or test runs. From Newport onward, the Werribee Line runs parallel to a separate standard gauge line carrying interstate freight and passenger traffic to and from South Australia. All footage and photographs used in this video are my own, unless mentioned otherwise on screen. At the time I'm writing this, the Werribee and Williamstown lines through run with the Frankston line on the other side of the bay. They're coloured green on the network map and are known internally as the Cross City Group. However, there's no real public term for this, and PTV just refers to them separately as the Frankston, Williamstown and Werribee lines. After the Melbourne Metro Tunnel opens in 2025, the plan is for Werribee and Williamstown to through run with Sandringham instead, with the whole Cross City Group taking the current Sandringham line pink colour. Cross City trains usually use platforms 8, 9 or 10 at Flinders Street, but can also use 7 and 12. Heading towards Werribee, the line runs via the through suburban lines, which are the two tracks closest to the Yarra River, crossing the new part of the Flinders Street Viaduct, which was built as part of the City Loop construction in 1978. At Southern Cross, the through lines run through platforms 13 and 14. The line then continues out through Franklin Street Junction, which is where V-Line's Geelong trains used to join the route. At North Melbourne, the Werribee Line runs through platforms 5 and 6, but it is also possible to run through 3 and 4 on the main suburban if required. At North Melbourne Junction, the Upfield Line curves away to the north, and the 6 tracks carrying the Werribee, Sunbury and Craigieburn lines continue northwest, passing over the Moonee Ponds Creek and simultaneously under the M2 CityLink freeway, which carries the Skybus to Melbourne Airport, as well as some people who haven't figured out how to use public transport yet. The Craigieburn line then diverges away towards Kensington, with those trains usually running on the low-level route via the East Suburban, but they can also run across this flyover and join up with the through suburban. We're now running parallel to the regional rail link, the RRL, carrying V-Line trains, and also the independent goods line, used by freight trains heading towards the North Melbourne Arrivals Yard or beyond to the east of the city. As the RRL drops down to the same level as the Werribee line, there are a number of crossovers allowing trains to swap between these lines. However, the RRL is not electrified, so it can't actually be used as an alternative route for electric suburban trains. We then arrive at the next station, South Kensington. Whoops. South Kensington is well known as being the most beautiful station in Melbourne, featuring everything you could ever want as a passenger, from its substantial buildings and shelters to its attractive pedestrian underpass. The up platform is so spacious that as many as one entire person can fit between the building and the yellow line. Just quickly, for those not familiar, I'm going to be saying up and down a lot. Up is railway language for towards the city, down is towards the country. South Kensington opened as a station in 1891 and shares its name with a London Underground station on the Circle, District and Piccadilly lines, but Londoners are no doubt very jealous of our South Kensington. At this point, the Werribee line is still running parallel to the Sunbury line. Originally they shared the double track on this section, but the line was quadruplicated in 1976 with the St Albans line, now the Sunbury line, getting its own dedicated track pair to the north. Not wanting to spoil South Kensington's sheer untouched beauty, the new track pair was built without platforms here, so it became normal for only Werribee line trains to stop here. Until recently, there was a set of crossovers at the down end allowing trains from the Sunbury line to use the platforms here if required, and I think some late night trains used to do this, but they were removed in mid-2023 as part of the construction of the Melbourne Metro Tunnel, the entrance to which dives down right next to South Kensington on the northern side. To the south of the station is the North Dynon Rail Yards, and there's actually no public access in that direction, but railway employees can exit the station to the south via this rather intimidating looking gate. About 600 metres beyond South Kensington, the line crosses the Maribyrnong River, showing 3 distinct eras of railway bridge design. The Werribee line passes over a large steel truss bridge supported on bluestone abutments, which date from the original line opening in 1859. However, the actual steel truss was replaced in 1911. The Werribee Line Bridge is flanked by the 1976 Sunbury Line Bridge to the north, made up of large steel girders, and the 2015 RRL Bridge to the south, which is concrete. For a very random fact, this happens to be one of only 2 places I've ever seen a platypus in the wild. It happened just after dawn one morning in 2013 when I was standing on the riverbank waiting to take this picture. Just beyond the bridge, passengers get a good view of a large Chinese temple dedicated to Mazu, goddess of the sea. The temple was under construction for well over a decade, with the statue first appearing in 2008, but the building construction continued right up until just a few years ago. Just beyond the temple, the RRL raises up on a flyover and jumps over the Werribee line, shuffling into position to divert away to the north when we get to Footscray. Before the RRL was built, the Werribee line used to take a much more even curve here, and this was also the site of a junction for the Maribyrnong River goods line, which was a long industrial siding heading south along the river from here. And while the junction is now gone, quite a bit of the track is still in place further down. The main lines then continue around the curve, under the Hopkins Street Bridge and into Footscray, which has 6 platforms accommodating the 3 double-track lines. This is where the Werribee line curves away from the others, and it's important to note that there aren't any physical connections between the lines here, so the actual junction, operationally speaking, was all the way back on the other side of South Kensington. Apparently when the line first opened in 1859, there were 2 physically separate stations on either leg of the junction here, but they were combined into a single station on the current site in 1900. There's also a 4th pair of tracks here which you might not immediately notice. The main goods lines heading into Melbourne come in alongside the Sunbury line, then curve down underneath the ends of the Footscray platforms and enter the Bunbury Street Tunnel, which carries trains about 400 metres under suburban Footscray, then out across the Maribyrnong and over towards Dynon and the docks. This line is dual gauge, and while it's generally referred to as the goods lines, it's also the route taken by all standard gauge passenger trains into Melbourne, which is currently our 2 interstate trains, the XPT to Sydney and the Overland to Adelaide, as well as V-Line trains to Albury. If you stand right at the down end of the up Werribee platform, that's platform 5, you can peer through the fence down into the cutting. It used to be possible to open a train door and look directly down through the gap between the train and the platform all the way down to the track and the cutting below, but that view has since been blocked by these things. Prior to the RRL being built in 2015, Footscray had 4 platforms, which are now platforms 3 to 6, and these platforms feature some lovely historic brick buildings. I particularly like this large triangular building on the island platform. There's also a former signal box on the up end of platforms 4 and 5, which dates from when this was a physical junction pre-1976. When the RRL was built, the Sunbury Suburban Line was shifted to a new set of platforms, now 1 and 2, with the RRL taking over their former platforms. Here's a picture I took from a helicopter in 2013 showing that construction work taking place, and you can see how the new platforms were built straight to meet modern requirements. Now, we can't talk about Footscray without mentioning the former iconic institution that was the Olympic Donut Stall. Famed for its upside-down Olympic logo and freshly made jam donuts, there was a time when no visit to Footscray was complete without patronising this fine establishment. When the extra platforms were built for the RRL in 2015, sadly the donut shop had to go. This was recognised as a serious problem, and they were provided with a brand new shop after construction was completed. However, the original business sadly didn't last very long. The shop is now a more general cafe, but they are still selling fresh jam donuts. Alright, thanks very much. Cheers. Cooked to order, and while it may be missing the rough charm of the old business, I can confirm that the donuts are still very much worth the visit. At the down end of the Werribee Line platforms, there's a single crossover, which allows trains to terminate here in either direction during disruptions. The line then continues along a small embankment, crossing Napier Street and Pilgrim Street, the latter of which has the original 1850s bluestone abutments, but with a much newer deck, something that's very common along the whole line. The next station, Seddon, is pretty unremarkable. It opened in 1906 and today has simple brick buildings and a nice old steel footbridge. The Victorian Railways often planted peppercorn trees in the area immediately around station buildings, but here they also stretch along the line side heading back towards Footscray. The line then continues southwest, cutting at an angle through the suburban grid and passing under Somerville Road before arriving at Yarraville. Yarraville Station is located entirely on a curve and features a substantial brick building on the up platform, as well as a large disused brick signal box. The downside building is a nice little weatherboard shelter. At the down end of the platforms is the Anderson Street level crossing, which still features a lot of old picket fencing, and 2 of the wooden interlocked gates are still in place on the eastern side, preserved in position alongside the current boom gates. The electrically operated pedestrian gates actually have the wooden pickets attached to them, and I'm not sure if there's anywhere else on the network like this. This is a very typical 20th century Melbourne suburban scene, with the shopping strip leading right up to the station and the level crossing. This is about to change, however, as this crossing is on the list to be removed by the Level Crossing Removal Project, and the plan here is actually to close the road completely, replacing it with just a pedestrian underpass. I think this will be a good outcome for Yarraville. It will allow the historic buildings to remain in place, reduce road traffic through the shopping area, and there are already grade-separated road crossings roughly 400 metres away in either direction from here. A nice wide underpass will be great here, as the current pedestrian crossing gets pretty crammed during peak hour, and it'll be good not to have to worry about cars doing things like this, especially as there are regular expresses through here. There are still a pair of rails visible in the asphalt leading to the former goods yard, which once occupied the space to the east of the line here. The signal which controlled movements leaving the goods yard is actually still here, hiding in this tree, and up the other end of the yard you can see some remaining track running under the Somerville Road Bridge. After Yarraville, the line straightens out and continues to slice south through the suburbs. It crosses Francis Street on a steel bridge. This must have originally been a level crossing, though I can't find any information on when it was grade separated. It then runs alongside a golf course and crosses Stony Creek, another one with the original bluestone abutments in place. We then pass under the Westgate Freeway's approach ramp to the Westgate Bridge, which carries the Route 232 bus into the city, as well as more confused people who have forgotten to take the train. The line then runs alongside Hall Street, which is a kind of long de facto commuter car park, and a place for the railways to dump unwanted sleepers, then crosses the Hudson's Road level crossing and arrives into Spotswood. Spotswood has a pair of attractive brick buildings which match in style, although the one on the up platform is about twice the size. Traditionally, nearly all stations have a larger building on the upside, as that's the side where the majority of people enter the system for the first time each day as they head to the city, so that's where most tickets would have been sold. The station we now know as Spotswood opened in 1878 and was named Edam, which only stuck for 3 years before being renamed Bayswater, not to be confused with the current station named Bayswater, which is a lot further from the bay, or water, way over on the Belgrave line. However, it kept that name for just one single month before being renamed again to Spotswood, spelt like this. It was changed to the modern spelling in 1905. However, you can still see a remnant example of the old spelling just across the road on the Spotswood Hotel. Next to the level crossing, just opposite said hotel, is a boarded up signal box which once controlled a number of industrial sidings in this area. I'm not going to mention every single former siding on this line as there were lots of them, but one of the more interesting and longer lasting sidings here was one that ran to the nearby AGM Glassworks. It diverged at the up end of the station, running past the hotel up along Hall Street, then curving around to the east. This siding was still in use up until 1998, and the track was still visible in the early 2000s. In this 2013 aerial photo, you can clearly see the former alignment. Much of that area has since been filled in with buildings, but if you look on the 2024 satellite view, it's still very clear that some of those buildings were built around the alignment. While Spotswood currently has a very pleasant historic appearance with the brick buildings and original overhead structures, this won't be the case for much longer, as the Hudson Street level crossing is also on the LXRP's removal list, which will involve elevating the line here and completely rebuilding the station. At the time I'm writing this, the design hasn't been publicly released, but hopefully the existing buildings will be retained and incorporated into the new station in some way. At the other end of the station, on the other side of the line, is the old Victorian Railways Stores branch building, the lettering of which is still very much intact, despite the VR ceasing to exist around 4 decades ago now. The building is still serving a railway purpose, being now occupied by John Holland, a rail maintenance contractor. Behind the building and alongside the railway is a yard which is home to the various track machines and maintenance vehicles involved in said rail maintenance. On the other side of the line here is some long disused track which once led to several more industrial sidings, most notably one for delivering coal to the Newport Power Station, which was built by the Victorian Railways to power the newly electrified suburban railway network in 1918. The original power station is now gone, but there's another power station still on the site, a gas-fired one, and the 183-metre high chimney is a very visible local landmark. The power station originally burned black coal imported from New South Wales, but by the 1950s it had been converted to burn briquettes, which were produced locally-ish in the Latrobe Valley, and the siding into the power station was electrified to allow the briquette trains to be hauled by the stylish L-class electric locos. You can still see some remains of that electrification today, both on the main line overhead structures and on the former alignment towards the power station. We're now just about at Newport, which is a junction. Actually, it's 2 junctions, one at each end. The line coming in from the northwest here is the goods line from Tottenham and Sunshine, and it's also the interstate standard gauge main line, carrying all freight trains heading to and from South Australia and points beyond, as well as the twice-weekly overland passenger train to Adelaide. The goods line at this point is single-track dual gauge, so 3 rails catering for both standard and broad gauge trains. The goods line slowly winds around the back of the Newport station building, and actually isn't very obvious from the platforms, being largely obscured by trees, so you might not even notice there's a track there until a 1800 metre long freight train rolls through. It continues around the back of the signal box and under the Melbourne Road Bridge, after which the two gauges separate, with the broad gauge joining up with the main suburban line and the standard gauge continuing parallel, something it does all the way out to Werribee and beyond, and suburban passengers are often treated to parallel runs with interstate freight trains. The other junction at Newport is at the down end, with the Werribee line curving away to the west and the Williamstown line heading southeast. Within the triangle formed by that junction is the Newport Workshops, Melbourne's oldest functioning railway workshops dating from 1882. In a moment we'll take a closer look at the station area, but first this is probably a good point to fill you in on the line's earliest history, which is closely tied to the Newport area. The first part of this railway to open was the line from Geelong to Newport on the 25th of June 1857. However, it didn't run into the current Newport station, but instead to a small temporary station called Greenwich, over on the bank of the Yarra, from where passengers and goods completed the journey to the city by boat. At this point, the only other railway lines completed in the entire state were those to St Kilda and Port Melbourne, which today are tram lines, so that does make the line from here to Werribee and Geelong the oldest operating railway that's still a railway in the state. The very first lines to appear in Victoria were built and operated by private companies, a lot like early railways in the UK. And the Geelong line was built and run by the Geelong and Melbourne Railway Company, the GNMR. Another company, the concisely named Melbourne, Mount Alexander and Murray River Railway Company, the MMA and MRR, had been building a line from Melbourne to Williamstown, but they never got to the point of actually running trains, so the GNMR was able to take over their alignment, completing the section down to the pier at Williamstown. This section was opened just 3 and a bit months after trains started running into Greenwich, and that station was immediately abandoned, becoming Victoria's first closed railway station. 15 months later, in January 1859, the line through to Melbourne Spencer Street was completed, and 18 months after that, the GNMR was absorbed by the Victorian Railways. I don't think there's anything to see of the line to Greenwich today, but it ran down North Road, quite possibly just in the middle of the road given the temporary nature of the line. While I didn't find any evidence of the railway, I did find this surviving Connex bus replacement sign. The station was here somewhere, probably quite close to the water given the connecting boat service, and the area is still known as Greenwich Reserve. The alignment is actually extremely close to the alignment of the power station sidings, which were built here 60 odd years after Greenwich closed. Okay, so back to present day Newport. The two platforms at Newport are both bidirectional, but the track layout is a bit restrictive with only limited crossovers. At certain times, the Williamstown line operates as a 3-car shuttle from Newport, with passengers changing here for Werribee line trains to the city. This is one of only 2 places on the network where 3-car suburban trains still run in normal service, and it used to be consistently an off-peak thing, but these days it's a bit more complicated and not exactly easy to remember. But outside these times, Williamstown gets direct trains to and from the city. During shuttle running, the 3-car train comes in from Williamstown on platform 1, then shunts forward to one of these 2 sidings, allowing an up Werribee train to come through and collect its passengers. A down Werribee will then come through, with passengers for Williamstown waiting on platform 2, where they will be collected by the shuttle as it heads out on its next trip. One of the 2 sidings is a through siding, allowing a direct route between the platforms and the goods lines, although this is not a particularly common move. Up Werribee trains can terminate on platform 1, then head back towards Werribee, and the opposite is possible for down trains terminating from the city. There's no way to the Williamstown line from platform 1, so once the shuttle has arrived there, it has to shunt via the siding. While not normally done, it is possible to run a Williamstown train directly into platform 2, where it can reverse direction without using the sidings, and I did see this happen once. There's access from both platforms into the workshops, and there are lots of possible moves here, including running directly from the workshops to the goods line via either platform, as well as running from the workshops into the platform then out to Williamstown or Werribee or vice versa. Like most junctions in Victoria, this one has a distinctly straight and a distinctly curved direction, with trains allowed to do normal line speed towards Williamstown, but limited to 40 km/h medium speed around the curves towards Werribee. This is a pretty unusual case of the main line being the direction subjected to medium speed, and it's worth considering that when this junction was first constructed, Williamstown was considered the more important of the 2 lines, with the port at Williamstown playing a much more significant role than it does today. This is also reflected in the early name of the station, which was called Geelong Junction when it first opened in 1859. The convention for naming junction stations was to use the name of the less significant branch. In this case, you're heading to Williamstown, and by the way, that's the junction to Geelong. Just 10 years later, in 1869, it seems that the shift had already happened towards Geelong being considered the main line, with the station renamed to Williamstown Junction. It only kept that name for 12 years before getting its current name of Newport in 1881. The station buildings are nice red brick structures, and there's a signal box at the down end, which is still in use, controlling local train movements through this area. Immediately on the eastern side of the station is Tate Street, presumably named after the Victorian Railways Commissioner Thomas Tate, who also had the Tate trains named after him. In Victoria, we're lucky enough to have very frequent heritage trains operating across the public network, and Newport Workshops is home to 3 of Victoria's 4 mainline heritage train operators, and currently the home of all our mainline certified steam locomotives. Because of this, you'll see a highly disproportionate amount of these trains coming through Newport, as all of them have to come through these platforms on exiting the workshops, generally as they make their way into the city where most special tours begin, and many of them also make pickup stops at Newport. As an extension of this, it's probably worth mentioning that anyone living along the line between Newport and the city probably has a very distorted view of how common steam traction still is in the modern era, with steam-hauled trains coming past most weekends during the steam season. Now, this video was essentially going to be about the Werribee line, but it's not very far to Williamstown, and it would make an awkward short video if I did that separately, so we're going to do it right now. Departing Newport, be sure to sit on the right-hand side of the train for a good view of the workshops. The first part you'll see is Metro's Newport Depot, which has stabling space for, I think, 15 6-car trains. There's also some track here that isn't connected to anything, which is part of the Rail Academy and used for training purposes. The next major section you'll see is West Block, which is the most historic part of the workshops and home to the 3 mainline heritage operators: SteamRail Victoria, 707 Operations, and the Diesel Electric Rail Motor Preservation Association of Victoria. It's pretty remarkable that this site is still being used for more or less its original purpose after 140 years, and the historic value of the buildings is made all the more significant by being an operational site. West Block is open to the public once every 2 years as part of the Newport Workshops Open Weekend, which is an amazing chance to see inside this operating workshop, as well as getting up close to all manner of trains. At the time of making this video, the next open weekend will be in early 2026. The next part of the workshops is East Block, which is home to a lot of stored/abandoned rolling stock, including, at the moment, a lot of Hitachi cars. And then beyond that is the part of the workshop still used for maintaining the current fleet, both Metro and V-Line. Back in the days when the Victorian Railways were the state's biggest employer, special passenger trains for the use of workshops employees used to run from the city directly into the workshops, and there were 2 very basic platforms used by these trains, one near the Tarp Shop, which no longer exists, and one known as Garden Platform, which are still in place today and occasionally used by the heritage groups. Bizarrely, it also appears in most Melway editions, including the 2023 one, despite having never been a public station. Just before the workshops ends, the line descends into a level crossing removal project trench on the approach to North Williamstown Station, which was sunk by the LXRP in 2021. The former ground level station here had red brick buildings and bluestone platform edges typical of many stations on the line. The LXRP rebuild retained the historic upside building at ground level, which looks nice, although you can't actually walk through it anymore. The downside building was demolished, and the structure supporting the platform awning was relocated into this little park on the western side. Roughly where that building once stood is this plant room, which has been decorated as a very low-resolution version of Victoria's largest ever steam locomotive, H220 Heavy Harry. I'm sure you'll agree it's very lifelike and almost like seeing the real thing. However, if you'd like to see a more detailed version of Harry, you don't have to look very far, because the real H220 still exists and is just around the corner in the Newport Railway Museum. The museum was formed in the early 60s with the aim of saving examples of Victorian Railways steam locomotives that were being withdrawn en masse at the time. As well as the one-off H-Class, which has always been the star attraction, there are many steam locomotives here which are the only surviving members of their class, such as X36, Suburban Tank Loco D4268, and a handful of small 19th century locos, which honestly I don't know that much about, so you'll just have to visit yourself and check them out. From the 70s onwards, the museum started looking beyond steam and started acquiring examples of VR diesels and electric locomotives, and highly relevant to this channel's audience, there are also several examples of suburban electric cars. The museum is open every Saturday, and I'll put a link to their website down below. Okay, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, the Williamstown line. At the down end of North Williamstown, the line ducks under Colroyd Creek Road, then climbs back up to ground level and curves gently along between the creatively named Railway Crescent and Railway Place before arriving at the next station, Williamstown Beach. Much in the style of other early stations on this line, it has substantial red brick buildings and bluestone platform faces, with the platforms being entirely on a curve. It opened in 1889 and was initially just called Beach, having the Williamstown bit added in 1915. Incidentally, over on the other side of the bay, Brighton Beach Station was also originally just called Beach, but became Brighton Beach in 1867, well before this beach opened. In case you haven't realised yet, people in the 19th and early 20th centuries loved renaming stations. The beach which gives the station its name is about 450 metres to the south and is a nice little curved beach and a good spot for a swim. The line then straightens out and crosses Gifford Street, then drops down gently, passing under Cole Street and Thompson Street, the bridges for which are both wide enough to accommodate some extra tracks, which were located here back when Williamstown had a busy goods yard. Today, the line terminates in a simple single platform at Williamstown, although you can clearly see where the former yard was located. Up until just a few years ago, the original overhead wiring gantries were still in place and clearly wide enough to accommodate the former yard trackage, but these have now been replaced with the modern type, positioned for the single track only. Williamstown Station building is a unique design and very historic, being part of the original building constructed here in 1859. What we see today is the centre part of the original building. Apparently it once had extra rooms at both ends, but its appearance is still largely original and it's actually one of the oldest public timber buildings in the state. There's also this nice little VR shed at the end of the platform. Passing over the end of the platform is the lovely Ann Street footbridge dating from 1883, featuring ornate ironwork and the original builder's plates, naming the builder as M. Ferguson of the Carlton Foundry. The bridge was derelict and partly dismantled for many years, but received a full restoration and reopened to the public sometime between when I took this picture in August 2006 and my next visit in July 2009. Apart from looking nice and providing a good vantage point for photography, this footbridge is very notable for being almost completely pointless. Trains stop just short of it, and the usable section of track only continues another 10 metres or so, beyond which you can just walk around at ground level. However, this footbridge would have been very important in the past, because if you haven't spotted it yet, this wasn't always the end of the line. Beyond the ground level footpath, you can clearly see where the line once continued, curving around to the left and continuing about 500 metres to one more station, Williamstown Pier. Here's what that spot looked like in 2009, when some of the track was still in place, as well as the original overhead structures. Today the track is gone or buried and the overhead has been renewed, but funnily enough it's still got this big double track gantry here, carrying the feeder wires from this little substation. There's another very historic object here, this sign displaying two downward pointing white lines. This is a series board telling drivers of early electric trains to depart towards Williamstown Pier with the master controller in the series position. These signs could also display two upward lines for series parallel or horizontal lines for coast. And while there are quite a lot of these remaining around the network, most of them look like this or this, and there's only a handful of these freestanding ones still surviving. Williamstown Pier was the original terminus of the line when trains were diverted here from Greenwich in 1857, and the station was originally just called Pier. However, with the declining importance of the Williamstown docks, the station closed permanently in 1987. This was also the site of Victoria's first major railway workshops, which was built here in 1858. And remained the main workshops until 1889 when that role was taken over by the brand new and much larger workshops at Newport. Today, the site of Williamstown Pier Station is occupied by a particularly grim abandoned car park, and there's really not much to see in the way of railway relics at all. Although if you head up a bit closer to the docks, there is some track still in place leading over towards various piers and warehouses. The broader yard and workshops area has been rehabilitated and is now the Point Gellibrand Coastal Heritage Park. Okay, I think that's it for Williamstown. Let's quickly hop back to Newport and continue with the main story.
Good afternoon, passengers. Joe 116 Flinders Street service, stopping all stations to Flinders Street. We'll be departing very shortly.
Heading out of Newport, the main line curves around to the west and passes the historic Newport substation, which was built in 1915 as part of the original railway electrification scheme. It no longer houses electrical equipment and in fact is now a gallery and performance space. However, don't make the mistake I did and expect to get a look inside on a regular weekday. They are only open for specific events. The line runs along the top side of the workshops to a location known as Newport South. The broad gauge goods line joins the main line here, and there's also a connection to the stabling yard in the workshops, and a pair of crossovers between the up and down lines. The main reason for these is that the line beyond here, all the way to Werribee, and in fact Geelong, is signalled for bidirectional operation, so trains can run on either track in either direction. As far as I'm aware, right-hand running never happens as part of the normal timetable, but it does allow for a lot of flexibility in the case of train or infrastructure faults. Because of the bidirectionality, the two tracks shouldn't technically be called the up and down lines beyond here, and their official names are the East Line and West Line. Given this line geographically travels a lot more east-west than it does north-south, I probably would have called them the North Line and the South Line, which is what they did under very similar circumstances over on the Gippsland Line, but nobody asked me. An odd thing about the geometry here is that the line actually does a little wiggle to the south, meaning that the crossover between the down line and the west line is actually the only straight option, and the normal mainline routes are both signalled for 65 km/h medium speed. The reason for the wiggle is that the standard gauge main line through here was only built in 1995, and for this next section, the two broad gauge tracks are slewed slightly to the south, with the new standard gauge track occupying the former alignment of the up broad gauge track. This results in an interesting situation where the standard gauge runs through the original 1920s overhead wiring gantries, with a new support added on the southern side to support the wires for the broad gauge East Line. Immediately beyond the crossovers at Newport South is the Champion Road level crossing, which, like Yarraville, is due to be removed and closed to road traffic permanently, replaced by a pedestrian bridge. Road traffic will use nearby Maddox Road and a new connection back to Champion Road, and the Maddox Road crossing itself will be grade separated with the railway going over the top. I assume this project will eliminate the historic overhead structures over the standard gauge, so admire that unusual feature while you still can. A short distance beyond Maddox Road, there's a brief section of line where there are actually 4 different railway gauges running parallel. Yes, you heard that right. There's the 2 broad gauge tracks, the standard gauge track, and the Altona Miniature Railway, which is dual gauge with both 5-inch and 7¼ inch gauge trains able to operate. The AMR operates over a 1.5 kilometre circuit and is open to the public on the 3rd Sunday of each month, something they've been doing since 1986. It's pretty cool being able to watch full-size trains roll past while going for a ride, unless you go on the day I did when the Werribee line was closed for track work. They also have a large picnic area and a W7 class tram. Back on the big trains, the slewed section of line ends here with the broad gauge back on its original alignment, and we have now arrived at Altona Junction, where the Altona Loop line splits off from the direct express route to Laverton. The line speed from the city so far has been 80 km/h, but the limit on the line towards Altona is 65, while the express route is Melbourne's maximum speed for suburban trains, 115 km/h. The line down through Altona has a very interesting early history. The first part of it opened as a very short branch to Williamstown Racecourse in 1885. Then in 1888 it was extended into Altona as a private railway built by the Altona Bay Company, but the passenger service only lasted 2 years. 5 years later, in 1895, the line was extended slightly to a small coal mine, and operated for less than a year before being abandoned. But the mine and associated rail traffic started up again in 1908. In 1917, a passenger service returned using the rather unusual arrangement of a steam loco hauling a pair of these bizarre-looking McKean petrol rail motors, which had had their engines removed, having not been very reliable as actual rail motors. In 1924, the line was taken over by the Victorian Railways, administratively joining the state network, and it was electrified in 1926. The main route to Werribee wasn't electrified until 1983, and in 1985 the Altona line was extended 4.5 kilometres to join up with the main line at Laverton, creating the loop we see on the network map today. For most of the half-century between electrification and being joined up at Laverton, the Altona line operated as a shuttle from Newport, connecting with Williamstown line trains to and from the city, basically the reverse of what happens today with the Williamstown shuttle. The Altona shuttle was frequently operated using a single-car train, initially using a double-ended swing-door motorcar, and later one of the 4 Tate double-ended motors. Now that we've got a bit of an overview of what's going on here, let's have a closer look at the Altona Loop, then we'll come back and do the express section. The junction is right next to the Mobil Oil Refinery, a pretty unusual environment to see suburban trains, and the line curves away from the main line passing through the refinery, with oil-related infrastructure on both sides. The line immediately starts climbing as it passes over the top of Corroit Creek Road, which was a grade separation project completed in 2018. And yes, that's the same Corroit Creek Road that was grade separated over at North Williamstown. Roughly where the northern end of the ramp is now, there was once a station, which opened in 1953 and was called Standard Oil Platform, renamed a year later to Mobiltown. As you might expect, its purpose was for the use of refinery employees, but in 1958 it was made a public platform and most trains stopped there. It closed permanently in 1985 due to very low patronage. I photographed the site in 2011 before the grade separation changed the area completely, but even then there were no obvious remains of Mobiltown to be seen, and as an extra bonus I got shouted at by a refinery security guard. This is what that same location looks like today. For a pretty insignificant station, I was quite surprised to learn that there's a song about it, Last Train from Mobiltown by Broderick Smith of the 1981 album Broderick Smith's Big Combo. It was released 4 years before the station closed, so I'm assuming when he says last train, he's singing about the last train of the day rather than the last one of all time. Just on the other side of Cororoit Creek Road is the site of Williamstown Racecourse Station, which was a terminus used by special race day trains only and had no through connection towards Altona. Prior to the grade separation, there were some visible remains of the Racecourse Station area. Those are some overhead wiring pole bases, and there was this number 8 on a post. I'm not quite sure what that related to. However, as far as I can tell, all those relics are now gone. There isn't much left of the actual racecourse either, just some concrete foundations where the grandstand once grandly stood. The whole area has now been rehabilitated into the Altona Coastal Park, and today is a very healthy looking bit of coastal ecosystem. The line drops down off the bridge and immediately becomes single track, which remains the case all the way to Laverton. It winds scenically across this large open area of coastal salt marsh and crosses the Cororoit Creek on a low bridge. If you happen to be interested in both bird watching and train watching, I know there's a lot of you out there, this is a great spot for it, with a huge variety of both local and migratory shorebirds and trains. This low-lying area is subject to flooding, and the parallel running road crosses the creek on a ford which sometimes has to be closed, though I can't say I've ever heard of the railway becoming flooded here. This egret was waiting to catch creatures being washed through the culvert under the road. It caught a crab just after I stopped filming. A bit further along there's a passive pedestrian crossing, one of the safer places for a passive crossing given the wide open landscape, which has some very non-standard painted metal fencing, and it seems not all of the locals know how to cross here safely. The line then enters the suburb of Seaholme, and you can see some of the housing here is protected against flooding by this wall. The street on the other side of those houses is called Waters Drive, but obviously they didn't want that taken too literally. The line continues parallel to Altona Road and crosses over Cherry Creek, which is really a big outlet drain from Cherry Lake, a flood retention basin built in the 1960s. About 300 metres further on, the line crosses the Civic Parade level crossing. This might be a good time to point out something. The level crossing removal project has been proudly suggesting that once their current Werribee Line projects are complete, the Werribee Line will be level crossing free. However, when they say that, they're only talking about the direct route to Werribee via the express section. Since it was joined up in the 80s, the Altona Line is absolutely considered part of the Werribee Line. It's on the Werribee Line timetable, and there's no Altona Line listed in PTV's information, so for all intents and purposes, we are still on the Werribee Line here. And there are 5 level crossings on the Altona Loop, which I don't see any plans to remove. I have no idea if this is deliberately misleading or just a misunderstanding of Melbourne's line naming conventions. After Civic Parade, the line curves gently into Seaholme Station, which is entirely on a curve and features this lovely weatherboard station building. Seaholme opened in 1920 towards the end of the steam era, and trains today have come about 5.5 kilometres from the previous station at Newport. The station and surrounding housing estate were named as the result of a public competition. I'm not an expert, but I think it has something to do with the sea and home. An unusual feature here is that the station is surrounded by lots of date palms, about 17 of them by my count, and the whole area looks really nice, which I think is a genuinely important part of encouraging public transport use and pride in our public infrastructure, though it did look even nicer before they ran this rather ugly fence right down the middle. At the down end of the station is another passive pedestrian crossing, which is a good photography vantage point, and the line continues across another road level crossing with Millers Road. For the next 1800 metres, the line kind of runs down the middle of a street. On the north side of the line is Railway Street North, which is a one-way road for eastbound traffic, while the traffic in the other direction uses Railway Street South on the other side of the line. Technically speaking, this is really just the railway running between 2 separate one-way streets, given the north and south added to the names, but functionally it really is a railway running down a median strip. Early on, I suspect this was more or less proper street running here on a wide dirt road, and pretty much all these north-south running streets would have had level crossings. To this day, they have the same name both sides of the line, with a sign like this on the railway fence greeting people trying to find the other half of the street. Despite these divisions, it's never particularly far to a pedestrian crossing, and I think this section of line is a wonderful example of how an electric suburban railway line can quite seamlessly integrate into residential suburbia. When there's no train going past, you could quite easily not even notice the railway here, yet thousands of passengers roll up and down this corridor every single day. The line then crosses over Pier Street and arrives at Altona Station. As you might expect, this station is alongside the Altona Town Centre, and it's a little under 400 metres to the beach from here, where you can visit this combined ice cream and fish and chip shop. The first station, called Altona, opened on this site with the initial line opening in 1888. When passenger trains returned in 1917, the station was reopened as Altona Beach, dropping back to just Altona in 1938. The current building at Altona is one of those fairly boring 70s brick ones, and there's this rather unusual electrical cabinet, which is an almost exact replica of South Australian Railway's 700 class steam locomotive 706. Altona is also one end of the 903 orbital bus route, which runs 86 kilometres from here around the suburbs to Mordialloc, 27 kilometres away. From here, the line speed increases to 80 kilometres per hour, and a little further along we come to another pedestrian crossing, an active one this time, protected by these pedestrian boom gates, which are fairly unusual around the network, but there's actually quite a few of them along the Altona Loop. The last part of the line running between Railway Street North and Railway Street South finishes at the level crossing with Grieve Parade. This was the terminus of the line for most of that initial 2-year operating period in 1888, and the station here was called Altona Beach. Yeah, not to be confused with the later time period where Altona Station was called Altona Beach. This Altona Beach was almost twice the distance from the beach called Altona Beach compared to the later station called Altona Beach, now Altona. There was no station at Grieve Parade during the second passenger era when the line reopened in 1917. However, the line did continue through here at various times, running to the aforementioned coal mine, which was located just over here on the site now occupied by the Harrington Square shops. There's not much to be seen here today, but there is this small monument acknowledging the mining history of the site. When the line was built through to Laverton in 1985, a brand new station was built near the site of the former coal mine and named Westona, the result of another public competition. There's no suburb called Westona, it's just, the western part of Altona. Westona is a crossing loop with an island platform and the only place where trains can pass on the Altona Loop. Trains can run through in one direction only on each side, and unusually it's set up for trains to pass on the right-hand side, which I'm sure there's a reason for, but I can't spot it. In fact, this is the only station on the network where right-hand running is the only option. The platform numbers are also the opposite to usual, with platform 1 on the right when facing the city. The station building is a quite substantial brick structure built to a unique design, and it looks like one of the bricklayers was accidentally standing at a 45-degree angle. Like many island platforms, the view of the building from most of the platform is now blocked by a PSO pod. If we have a look at the shape of the housing to the west of Westona, you can see this curve here, which is exactly the kind of thing that gets my railway archaeology instincts kicking in. However, as far as I can tell, it's not and never was a railway alignment. However, I'm going to wildly speculate on something here. Apparently in the early days of the line, there was a proposal to extend it to Point Cook, which is exactly in that direction. So maybe that street was surveyed with a possible Point Cook line in mind? Or there might just be some other more boring reason for the curve. At the down end of Westona, the line crosses Maidstone Street. Like a lot of island platforms from this era, the pedestrian part of this crossing is divided in two, so it only activates across the track on which a train is actually coming, meaning there's a safe and legal place to stand in the middle. An odd feature at this particular crossing is this area here, which I guess provides space for a group of people to get stuck in the middle. But more importantly, it's a convenient space to stand and photograph trains. After Westona, the line shoots off into open grassland in a dead straight line heading for Laverton. After about 2.5 kilometres of this, the line splits into two tracks again as we approach Laverton Junction, where we rejoin the direct line from Newport. There's a small bridge over the Laverton Creek and Merton Street, which is a good place to see the various eras of bridges. This first one was built in 2010 when the third platform at Laverton was built. Then we see the original 1850s bluestone abutments, but with a modern concrete deck carrying the broad gauge main line. And finally the 1995 standard gauge bridge. The footpath here is actually an open grille directly above the creek. The line then passes under the M1 Princes Freeway before arriving into Laverton Station, where most trains that have travelled via Altona terminate. I don't normally go into timetables much in these videos because you can just look them up yourself, but I think here at Laverton we do need to paint a quick picture of the service patterns. The Werribee line has a distinct two-tier service operating for most of the day on weekdays, with a mixture of stopping all stations trains to Laverton via Altona and express trains to Werribee, stopping only at North Melbourne, Footscray, Newport and Laverton, then all stops to Werribee. During the weekday off-peak, each of these tiers runs every 20 minutes, providing a 10-minute frequency for stations served by both of them, and even better for those stations also served by Williamstown trains. However, before 5:30am and after 8pm, the line reverts to a single pattern, with all trains stopping all stations via Altona, and this pattern also applies all day on weekends. Now, if you've been admiring the aesthetic of this area and thinking it all looks a bit Mad Max, that's because it literally is. Several scenes from the 1979 Australian driving documentary Mad Max were filmed in this area, including this scene at Laverton. This was before electrification and also before the Altona Loop and the standard gauge had filled this area out a lot, but the location is still quite recognisable today. One of the film's most dynamic and enduring characters, this signal gantry, is still in place, having fortunately survived the apocalypse. and you can still experience similar driving experiences on the Princes Freeway today. Laverton Station has 3 platforms and is fully bidirectional, with trains from Altona able to run into any of the 3 platforms, although under normal circumstances down trains from Altona will run into platform 3, which is not accessible from the direct route, and trains that terminate here can reverse direction and return towards Altona, keeping fully clear of the main line. Trains on the express route run through 1 and 2, and in the case of a disruption it is possible to terminate in platform 1 in either direction. When trains are through running via Altona, they typically use 1 and 3. Prior to 2010, there were only 2 platforms here, what is now the Island platform. The new 3rd platform was built with this very unusual shelter spanning most of the platform length. And while not super attractive, it is very functional, actually sheltering the platform, something that often doesn't seem to be a requirement for new shelters. As part of the 3rd platform, the station received a new footbridge featuring some unusual graphic design, which also spread onto the old Island building. Look, I'm not here to judge, but yeah, it's fine. One thing I do like about this footbridge is that it's got windows on the sides rather than the usual metal grills, so you can actually get a reasonable view of passing trains. Okay, so now I've made it to Laverton, we need to quickly head back to Newport and have a look at the express route. Right, so we're back beside the refinery at Altona Junction, and this time we're taking the direct route, the old Geelong main line towards Laverton. There are no stations at all on the express section. Newport to Laverton is 10.5 kilometres, the longest gap between stations on the network, and it's 115 kilometres per hour, all the way to Werribee from here. Just beyond the junction, there's a siding which is used occasionally to load ballast trains. The siding is connected to the down line only, so an up train departing here would need to make use of the bidirectional trackage for the 1800 or so metres back to the crossovers at Newport South. Observant listeners will notice that I just called it the down line, despite earlier explaining that they're called the east and west lines here. Honestly, that's going to get confusing, so I'm just going to call them the up and down lines, which is not their correct names, but it is how they're normally used. Just next to the ballast siding is the site of yet another former station, Hatherleigh, which opened here on Valentine's Day 1890, but closed 7 years later, leaving no trace today. However, the same can't be said for the next former station, which is just 400 metres further on, and is one of the most visible closed stations on the network today, Paisley. Paisley was opened between 1929 and 1985, closing the same year the Altona Loop Line was joined up, and briefly overlapping with electric operation on this section, which had begun slightly earlier in 1983. Today, the Island platform is still in place, but the building has been removed and the underpass filled in. While trains haven't stopped here for nearly 40 years, I do have this one shot of the preserved Tate set stopping at Paisley on a test run. But for the most part, trains fly through here express. Next to the station is a small shopping strip, which isn't looking particularly vibrant and probably died off with the closure of the station. And there's also a big modern shopping centre just to the northwest of here, which probably didn't help. At the down end, Millers Road passes over the railway on a bridge, which would have once been a level crossing, and conveniently has a footpath on the eastern side protected by a barrier, providing a good spot to watch trains passing the former platform. Paisley is another non-suburb name. I'm not actually sure what its origin is, but this is the suburb of Altona North. If you do live in this area, there are still transport options to reach the city in the form of several bus routes, which leads me to this, what has to be one of Melbourne's strangest and most desolate transport facilities. This is the Altona North Park and Ride, a small 130-space car park feeding the terminus of the 232 bus. That's the same route I mentioned earlier that runs over the Westgate Bridge. In fact, it's an all-round weird route running from the Park and Ride directly north up Millers Road to the freeway, then a 15-minute express run over the bridge and into the city. I don't know what the story is behind this, but I imagine it might have been implemented as compensation for the loss of the rail service when Paisley closed. The car park is absolutely desolate, and when I visited around lunchtime on a weekday, there were only 2 cars parked there, and one of them was just someone parked having a nap. While I was here enjoying the ambience, a bus pulled up and I got chatting with the driver, who was definitely not used to seeing photographers here and was quite excited by my interest. He told me that despite appearances, a reasonable number of commuters do use this stop, but they're too scared to leave their cars parked here unattended, so they get dropped off by family. In addition to the obvious reasons for that, Apparently on windy days there's the added risk of debris from the surrounding scenery taking flight and damaging cars. So this is definitely one of the strangest places I've visited on Melbourne's transport network, but at least the bus drivers are friendly. When the Altona Loop first opened, the vast majority of suburban trains were rerouted to run that way, which no doubt influenced the closure of Paisley, and there were still very few suburban trains taking the express route in the 2000s, but these days the Werribee line is much busier, with frequent trains running both ways. And given the proximity of multiple bus routes, the shopping centre and quite a bit of housing, I can't help but feel that Paisley would probably be much better used if it was given another shot today. The line then curves slightly and passes over Cororoit Creek and then under Cororoit Creek Road. That's the final mention of that road. Cororoit Creek Road enthusiasts, you can tune out now. Thanks for joining us. Between the creek and the road, there was apparently yet another station, which opened as Commonwealth Oil Refineries Platform in 1927, was renamed British Petroleum Platform in 1958, and closed 1 year later. I couldn't find out much more about it than that, but going by the names, I'd say it's safe to assume it was primarily for the use of BP employees. We then pass over Cherry Creek, which runs into Cherry Lake that I mentioned earlier. The line is now heading straight for Laverton and continues through mostly industrial scenery. You can't really see it, but the line is running through the background of this shot. We then come to the Maidstone Street level crossing, and yes, this is the same Maidstone Street that runs past Westona about 1,200 metres away. This crossing is due to be separated shortly with the road going over, and I can't help but think that when the LXRP advertises that they're grade separating Maidstone Street Altona, they probably should be a bit more clear about which one they're talking about, because this is definitely the less obvious one. If you ever need a reminder of why it's important to stay clear of level crossings, this is a good place for it. On the downside of the crossing, the two broad gauge tracks separate briefly, creating an empty open space in the middle, which, by now you can probably guess, is the site of another former station. This was Galvin, which opened in 1927 and closed on the same day as Paisley in 1985. Unlike Paisley, I won't be making an argument that this could still be a useful place for a station. There is nothing going on here. That's the last closed station for a while, though not the last one completely, but if we take a quick look back at what we've seen so far, you can see there's an incredibly high density of closed stations in this area, which really can't be said for anywhere else in the city. We've got Greenwich, the two workshops platforms, Williamstown Pier, Mobletown, Williamstown Racecourse, Altona Beach Mark 1, Hatherley, Paisley, British Petroleum and Galvin, keeping in mind that the majority of those served very specific purposes and weren't all public stations. Past Galvin is Laverton Loop on the standard gauge, the only place standard gauge trains can pass one another on the section which runs parallel to the Werribee line. This huge facility belongs to SCT Logistics, one of our major interstate freight operators, and handles trains running all the way to Brisbane and Perth, including a lot of refrigerated traffic. Past the SCT depot, we arrive once more at Laverton, where we can now continue on the final part of our journey to Werribee. About 600 metres beyond Laverton, halfway to the next station, there's an active pedestrian crossing. Most level crossings that are near stations have a delayed activation when a stopping train is approaching, preventing the crossing being active too long in advance. However, this isn't the case here, and trains in both directions activate the crossing before stopping at their respective stations, meaning the gates stay closed for around 3 whole minutes for nearly every train. Just beyond this crossing is a single crossover between the up and down tracks, and the line then passes under Mayor Road on a curvy bridge, which replaced the former level crossing with Aviation Road in 2019. Aviation is about to become a bit of a theme here as we arrive at the next station, Aircraft. Aircraft, not to be confused with an aircraft, pictured here, first opened to passengers in 1926 as aviation siding, serving the nearby Royal Australian Air Force Base, which occupied a large area to the north of the line here. Despite being open to passengers, aviation siding was just that and didn't actually have a platform, but one was built a year later in 1927 and the location was renamed Aircraft Siding. In the 1930s it was relocated slightly further in the up direction, and in 1963 the name was shortened to just Aircraft. RAAF Williams is still an active Air Force base and a lot of historic buildings are visible from the train. However, the actual airfield and runway closed in 1996 and most of that area has now been redeveloped into the Williams Landing housing estate. Aircraft doesn't have a proper building, just this shelter, and is certainly one of the more exposed stations on the network. The pedestrian subway, which replaced the level crossing, is nice and wide, and also very green, which currently goes quite nicely with the Werribee line dark green on the signage, but is going to look very jarring when that changes to pink next year. There's a small strip of shops on the south side of the line containing an unusually high density of Thai massage parlours, including this thematically relevant one. Down trains can terminate here, returning to the city via the crossover back towards Laverton. Just over a kilometre away, on the other side of the Palmers Road Bridge, is the next station, Williams Landing, which was built new as part of the housing development, opening to passengers in 2013. If you look at the line between Aircraft and Williams Landing, you might notice a patch of slightly unusual looking overhead wiring poles. They're slightly shorter than usual and, although now a bit faded, are painted with red and white stripes. This was done due to their very close proximity to the runway to make the poles more visible to approaching pilots, who were hopefully not flying quite that low. The fact these are still visible today is an interesting direct link to the 13 or so year period between the line being electrified and the closure of the airfield in 1996. The station here is quite an unusual design. There's this strangely shaped blue concourse, which contains the station office, a shop, toilets, and a waiting room, and from my observations, it's a very busy place. The northern end of the concourse displays a large black and white photograph showing a couple of very early aircraft flying over this site, and you can just make out a train on the Geelong line below. I normally don't see much point in having waiting rooms at suburban stations, but one advantage here is that it's the only place you can wait where it's quiet, as the station's proximity to the Princes Freeway makes the outside areas extremely noisy. There's a very long footbridge linking the station to the southern side of the freeway, which looks very cool but provides absolutely no shelter or noise protection to pedestrians. At the base of the stairs on the north side, there's this sign telling us about the Lynch-Barclay Bridge, named after a pair of airmen killed here in an accident in 1967. And I assumed, based on the position of the sign, that it was talking about the station footbridge, the one right next to the sign. However, I later stumbled on the fact that the Lynch-Barclay Bridge is actually the nearby road bridge, which is not explained by the sign and in fact is barely even visible from this position. The development surrounding the station was essentially a greenfield site, and it seems completely baffling to me that they built the main shopping centre all the way over here and not immediately next to the station, while the area in between is mostly just a big car park. Just on the downside is a large wetland where water birds including pelicans and ibis can often be seen, hanging out watching trains. Beyond Williams Landing, the line continues dead straight for a while, running parallel to the Princes Freeway and, satisfyingly, with a slightly higher speed limit. We're going towards the city in this shot, just because the outbound freeway lane isn't as visible. The line passes under Forsyth Road and across Skeleton Creek, then curves slightly towards the southeast, passing under a freeway ramp and arriving into Hoppers Crossing. Yet another island platform, this station opened in 1970, quite late compared to most stations on the line, but still before electrification. Apparently the station and suburb were named after the Hopper family, who looked after the crossing gates here prior to the station being built. Hoppers Crossing. And I think that would make it the only station in the state specifically named after a level crossing. The building is a very utilitarian brick design. It's not the prettiest of stations. The ticket office is boarded up, but there is quite a large kiosk here, which promises an upgraded travel experience with their delightful range of food and beverages, perfect for energize your journey. Actually, they have a whole bunch of pretty brilliant homemade signs. Definitely check them out next time you swing by to grab a $7.50 love combo. The level crossing with Old Geelong Road, the Hoppers Crossing, was closed to road traffic in 2021 and replaced by a large footbridge. I'm not very impressed with how they did this one. The footbridge was built on the opposite side of the crossing from the station while the road was still open, and now the road is gone, there's this awkward 60-metre walkway between the end of the platform and the stairs up to the bridge. Given the road was closing permanently, I feel like they should have just closed it slightly earlier and put the footbridge right at the end of the platform. The open design of the walkway does at least provide this slightly unusual place to safely watch moving trains at close range. You can see the footbridge is wide enough to fit another track on this side, and they've even included the protective cover for the overhead wiring. While the footbridge is all grey from the outside, it's actually shockingly colourful inside. This feels very 90s to me. One thing I did like was this little triangular rock garden with a kangaroo paw in the middle. Weirdly, Hoppers Crossing was actually completely rebuilt for electrification in 1983, just 13 years after opening, and prior to that had been located on the other side of the level crossing. You can see how the gap between the two tracks continues for some distance, showing where the old platform was located. Before we move on, one common thing with all these stations that are near the freeway is some pretty atrocious pedestrian access from anywhere south of the line. Imagine you're lucky enough to live somewhere on this street here, just 690 metres in a straight line from the end of the platform at Hoppers Crossing. Your walk to the station is a convenient 4.8 kilometres. although the good news is you can save a bit of distance by walking to your second closest station instead, which is just 4.1 kilometres away. After Hoppers, it's more fast running with housing on both sides of the line. After about 2 kilometres, the two broad gauge tracks briefly split apart again, leaving a gap in the middle and pass over Derrimut Road. I can't find any specific information about why this gap exists, but it's suspiciously similar dimensions to other island platforms on the line, and is also dead in the middle of the gap between two stations, so I suspect there was a proposed station on this site which was never built. I'm not sure when Derrimut Road was grade separated down into this concrete trench, but it might have been when the standard gauge was put in 1995, given the girders for all three tracks look to be the same age. We're now almost at the end of the line, and your train will shortly start to decelerate for Werribee. The line passes under the Tarneit Road Bridge, which replaced a level crossing with Cherry Street in 2021. Werribee opened with the line in 1857 and today has 3 platforms, with trains able to terminate in any one of them. The 3-platform arrangement came into use with electrification at a time when this was still also the main line to Geelong, so this layout allowed a suburban train to terminate in platform 1, keeping the main line free for country passenger and goods trains, or if 2 suburban trains were present, there was still a 3rd platform available for through trains. Since country passenger trains no longer run this way and broad gauge freight trains are very infrequent, this arrangement isn't really necessary anymore and 2 would be plenty. All 3 platforms have remained available for use, although there's a strong preference to use the island platform made up of 1 and 2. The island is covered by a large shelter with a substantial ramp descending to an underpass in the middle. The wall around the top of the ramp has this unusual bit of seating sunk into little enclaves. There's also this unique little blue waiting shelter at the up end. Meanwhile, over on platform 3, there's a proper building, which is extremely historic. It actually dates from the opening in 1857 and was built by the Geelong and Melbourne Railway Company. However, its current appearance isn't very original. It was seriously damaged by fire in 1927, after which it received a new roof with a different profile, and the original bluestone walls were rendered in concrete, which is what you see today. At the down end of platform 3 is something a bit unusual. At some point you can see the platform was extended here, but the departure signal is still in its original position where the platform previously ended, and obviously can't be moved any further back due to the position of this crossover, which itself can't be moved further back because of the Werribee River Bridge being right there. This means that a train arriving here can't pull up right to the end of the platform unless this signal is cleared. However, there is just enough space to fit a 6-car train fully on the platform without passing the signal. Beneath the platforms is a large pedestrian subway where the ticket office now lives. And there's also a very unusual feature here, namely this shop, which is exactly what it looks like. This is the remains of Comenge Motorcar 388M, which was only in service for 4 years before being destroyed in an accident at Officer on the Pakenham line in 1987, when a V-Line train led by N457 ran up the back of it. Bizarrely, some of the undamaged parts of 388M were used to create this shop. You can see where different parts were stuck together here. There's no place on a Comenge with 3 windows in a row like that. They certainly didn't try to hide what it was, and it's still wearing its green and yellow Met livery. When I took this picture in 2014, it even had the remains of a Met logo, but that's the mid-90s version of the logo designed after the accident, so it must have been applied to the car when it was already in shop form. Here's what it looks like in 2024. The logo is gone now, but not much else has changed. The ramp at the southern end of the subway features a large decagonal skylight, which takes up quite a lot of space at ground level, but also provides some seating. The subway passes under Comben Road, conveniently emerging directly into this shopping area on Station Place, and the subway entrance has this quite cool artwork on the glass. While this is the end of the suburban line, it's not quite the end of the video because there are a couple of things we need to look at on the downside of Werribee to complete the story. Immediately beyond the station, the line crosses the Werribee River on a short but moderately high bridge, and it's quite a nice and peaceful spot. The broad gauge bridge has some impressive bluestone abutments at each end and a steel deck, as well as a concrete support in the middle, which is obviously not original. The standard gauge bridge is also made up of steel girders on concrete supports. Just beyond the bridge, the overhead wires come to an end, and the unelectrified line climbs up to pass over Werribee Street, which was another grade separation completed in 2021. There are 3 separate single-track bridges here, and this is the only place on the network so far where the standard gauge has been significantly altered for an LXRP project. Like most of the elevated separations, the land around and underneath the viaducts has been extensively landscaped. There's a lot of native planting and a playground, and most of the area underneath is a large skate park. This is also the only piece of rail infrastructure I'm aware of in Victoria that has feet, specifically these 2 large emu feet, in reference to the fact that emus apparently used to rest here, something they are certainly not doing today. This is arguably one of the worst value separations completed by the LXRP so far, at least in the short term, considering that with all suburban trains terminating at Werribee and V-Line trains avoiding this area by taking the RRL, There are really only about 12-ish trains a day on this section of line, comprised mostly of standard gauge freight trains, a handful of broad gauge freights, the overland twice a week, and of course the odd heritage train. The traffic here might substantially increase again in the future, as the Werribee line is supposed to get extended around to Wyndham Vale at some point, but there's not much movement on that at the moment. Suburban trains actually very nearly did extend beyond Werribee once before. Just under 2 kilometres beyond the current terminus is our final closed station, Werribee Racecourse, which opened in 1884 to serve the Werribee Racecourse. It consisted of a single platform on the north side of the line, and when Werribee was electrified in 1983, there was a plan to run the wires all the way out to the racecourse for special race traffic. This plan progressed far enough for overhead wiring poles to be erected as far as the racecourse platform, however the wires were never installed and electric trains never made it here. When the standard gauge was put through in 1995, the pedestrian access was cut off and the station was permanently closed. Surprisingly, the platform is still mostly intact today, as are the never-used overhead wiring structures, and there's even a 1980s-era tangerine sign. There is a lot of housing in this area, and it would be a pretty easy spot to build a new station, which hopefully might happen if the Wyndham Vale connection ever goes ahead. So that was the Werribee line. This has been the third video I've done in this style, looking at Melbourne suburban railway lines in excessive detail. You can find the full playlist linked down below. This video was made possible by my wonderful supporters on Patreon, who directly fund my time working on these projects. If you'd like to help support the channel, get updates on what I'm working on, behind the scenes content, and early access to videos, you can join for just a few dollars a month. All contributions are greatly appreciated. If you've made it through this whole video, congratulations, you've just listened to 13,740 words about the Werribee and Williamstown lines. Go get yourself an ice cream at Altona Beach, and thank you very much for watching.
The next station is Werribee. This train will terminate at Werribee.